Welcome to Fed Renaissance. If you're a former federal employee trying to figure out what's next, start a new business, or looking to remake yourself, you're in the right place. There's no need to walk this road alone. So many former feds have already generated their own success, so why not learn from the paths they've already traveled? I'm your host and federal government alum, Brandon Cory. Fed Renaissance exists to help make you successful and to support your journey of personal and professional self-discovery. Former feds are a formidable force. Come join the movement. Hey there, and welcome to the introductory episode of the Fed Renaissance podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Cory, and I am delighted that you have taken some time to join us here today. Your time is precious, and we're delighted, honestly, to have launched this. It's an idea I've been mulling over since probably early 2025. And given that we're all incredibly busy, the fact that you would choose to spend a bit of your time giving this a chance on what is something incredibly new is just something we're deeply grateful for. So thank you for doing that. And before we get too far into this, I just want to underscore that most episodes are actually not going to be like this. In other words, you're not going to hear me just drone on, and hopefully I won't do that here, but give some meaningful content. This podcast ultimately is not even about me. It's about us. It's about those of us who have left federal employment, who are moving into a new chapter, and it's intended to be an interview style format and exploring the stories of others. We'll get into that in a bit, but we thought we really owed it to listeners to give some idea of what Fed Renaissance hopes to accomplish at the outset, why we've decided to launch, who I am, those sorts of things. But that really is a good segue into the title of this episode that has a double meaning. What are we doing here? And that's intended to be a double meaning in the sense that you may find yourself in an unanticipated situation recently, perhaps unemployed by the federal government, and maybe you didn't see it coming, and you might be asking yourself quite literally, what am I doing here now? What do I do in this new chapter? You may have gone through the loss of not only your job, but the dissolution of an entire office, missing teammates that were important to you both professionally and personally, perhaps the dissolution of an entire agency, going through the RIF process, those sorts of things. But it's not only for those who have found themselves unexpectedly, say, unemployed by the federal government, but those of you who may be several months or even years into this journey. You also have a special contribution to make, which we'll talk about shortly. But in short, it's for those of us wrestling with questions of mission, of purpose, passion, calling, which really underpin anything we do, and exploring the idea of next steps, trying to figure out what in fact we are doing here now in this new chapter. But then the second meaning is, what is Fed Renaissance doing? What are we doing here as Fed Renaissance? What's this podcast intended to achieve? Why do we exist? Why did we launch to begin with? And the first answer to that, honestly, is encouragement. Giving former federal employees encouragement that they can launch into a new trajectory and provide goodness and meaning and value to the world. And that includes sharing the stories of others that have already done that or are doing that and making headway into that journey themselves. And frankly, for those who are newly separated from the U.S. government, this can be a scary time. And hearing from those of you who have been there and done that is incredibly important, particularly for those of you that did this months or years ago. And that can give folks a sense that there really is life beyond the previous normal that they have known. And so we want to explore those stories because having those concrete examples, I think, are extremely important. And we want to learn from those of you who are farther along in the journey than we may be. Another purpose is to share and showcase resources that folks might have come across along their journey. And that can take several forms, right? Those could be people themselves, networks and connections that you may not have known about before, products that folks have found that might have made things easier along the journey, and services that they have connected with that they may want to share with others that have just helped them in some form or fashion, right? And those things may or may not be affiliated, probably not affiliated with this program or podcast in any way, but it's helpful for us to highlight them where folks have found goodness. And we ultimately all benefit from somebody says, hey, there's a pond over here and it's got good fish and I recommend fishing there, right? So why not recommend that to others and point folks at least in the right direction? And finally, the third real response is to equip folks. And that is not only to provide resources, but to help folks take advantage of those resources, whether that's bolstering their repertoire with additional skills, helping them refine existing skills that they may have, or really to help them create newness and goodness in any way that might benefit them and society. And what we'll talk about a bit too is just to remind folks that you were who you are before your federal career, and your federal career simply added on to that and added onto characteristics you already had, and that's still innate within you. And finally, we just want to be a listening ear to those that we interview and a listening ear to the audience. But to view you as listeners as partners and friends and or sojourners with us, if you will, in this trajectory. I will just address politics and ethics briefly. I think that's important to mention in these days. This is not in any way a political podcast. There are already plenty of those out there fulfilling their niches just fine. We're really focused here more on fulfilling your human potential. And honestly, isn't that more exciting? I certainly think it is. So we are intentionally not diving into politics here, but focus on how we can move into the post-federal environment and to do that successfully. We're certainly not going to advocate for anything that violates federal laws or executive orders or ethics regulations. Those things are very strong and omnipresent and ubiquitous, if you will, in the federal community. We want to make sure that folks respect that. If for any reason we have existing feds on the program, then yes, we want them to respect and follow those ethical guidelines to ensure they're not in conflict with any of those, which probably brings us to one of our final topics, which is, well, who are you? Who am I? Very fair question. Brandon Cory is who I am, and that is in fact a pseudonym, and that's very intentional. Not that I have anything to hide. But I always told myself when I was a kid, if I ever did anything on TV or entertainment or something like that, I'm going to have a pseudonym. Why? Because my last name is alphabet soup. It's got a lot of consonants and very few vowels. It's very long. Some people have injured themselves just trying to pronounce it. Just kidding. But it's a long last name, so there it is. But you can easily find me, and that's fine. That's part of my story as well. That I want to be very transparent about. I am the former Chief Data Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID. So Chief Data Officer, USAID, feel free to Google me. You'll find me just fine. But if you want to call me Brandon Cory for simplicity, that's great. That's probably easier for both of us. So no problem. And I'm sure by this point, in the news cycle, I am sure you've seen a few articles about that particular agency, and that's great. But that's not what this podcast is about either. This podcast isn't about me, but I do want to address a few things up front because you're probably wondering, hey, well, what about all these articles or these things reported in the media about USAID? Look, I'm just going to say I didn't see any evidence of gross widespread negligence or fraud while I was at USAID or even after, or anything around it. I'm not saying it did exist or did not. I'm just saying it was not my observation. It was not part of my lived experience, not part of the lane I operated in. In any government agency, you're going to see stuff where you're like, I don't know if we should have spent the money on that. Find me an entity where that doesn't exist. But was there widespread gross negligence, stuff happening under the table, this side, that side? Absolutely not in my lived experience, not what I saw. So I just want to put that out there. For our part, we did our absolute best to make sure, as the agency's data team, that we captured and preserved the data paid for by U.S. taxpayers, and did our best by the data to handle that responsibly and ethically so that the agency and others could make data-informed and evidence-informed decisions. That's what we were all about. Had an amazing team that did that, and that's pretty much it. And I will leave it at that, but wanted you to know that at the outset. So with that out of the way, I do share that to say that I very much empathize with what you may be feeling during your post-federal employment or your post-federal what's next, right? And particularly if that unemployment was unexpected. I empathize with that because that was part of my lived experience as well. If you had told me at the beginning of 2025 that my agency would cease to exist, I would not have believed you. I would have chuckled or laughed. It really seemed unthinkable at the time because, again, based on my lived experience and anybody in the federal government, you go through different administrations, things shrink, things get bigger, things change. Okay, great. But the entire elimination of an agency, for me, pretty surprising in the elimination of thousands of jobs. So I'm one of many. And if you happen to be going through that reality right now, I do empathize. I've lived it. And the term grief is not an exaggeration, particularly if you poured so much of yourself and your gifts, your talents, your abilities, and your passions into something in which you deeply believed. That is something that I deeply believed in as well, in terms of being able to help others. I had a passion for all things international, and this was a way to couple helping others with that international passion. And so that grief is not anything to be ashamed of. Certainly something I experienced, many of my colleagues experienced. And I'm not going to go through all those stages of grief, but yes, there's denial and disbelief and waking up in the morning and thinking, oh my gosh, is this real? Like, no, I can't even fathom this. Like, so I'm not going to my desk today. I'm not commuting. I'm not doing this anymore. Is this really happening? It's a reality, and there's a lot of denial, a lot to cope with there, where I couldn't believe it. And so I know you might be even feeling angry that this was so abrupt, and you can agree or disagree with whatever, political decisions or business decisions might have been made. But the reality is that your employment is used to provide for your needs, your family's needs. And so there's some understandable anger at that being gone if it was unexpected. And if it wasn't unexpected and you just retired or left voluntarily, then there's also some understandable disorientation of starting a new life when the normal has been predictable for the last several years. And that's a big deal as well. So searching for methods to address that is normal and part of the venue and the forum that we want to provide here. But just to say that you do have a very empathetic ear on this podcast, because I've been through that journey. In fact, I'll say that part of my own method of coping is with what we're doing here. And part of my method of coping is sharing that journey with others. I think it's true for the human experience in general that when we go through these things, it is easier when we share that with others. So being very frank here, I'm sharing my journey with you through this podcast. It can be tempting to self-isolate during those times, but in general, we do a lot better when we travel together, right? And so this is something very important to me, and I wanted to build a community around that. I know there are many communities, in fact, already around former feds and equipping them in different ways, but providing a venue for showcasing the actual stories of individuals who are building or have built something new, I haven't seen. And that's certainly a niche that I hope to help fill and walk through those stories with each of you, and particularly in those areas where folks have seen hope and opportunity. So again, resources and provide and means of starting a new life are things that we hope to share here. And perhaps even starting a life that might even be more fulfilling than the one you had prior with the federal government. So this feels very important to me at a personal level. I am not my job. I am not my agency. And to make a play on words here, I have agency. You have agency. You have the ability to chart a new path here and to move forward. And I want to demonstrate that I can continue to be creative, innovative, motivated, and ideally a restorative force for goodness in this world. It feels right and healthy to me, and I hope it brings health and goodness to you as well. With that, I want to say a final thing that I've already alluded to. but just to talk about identity and employment in general, particularly for those I know not all of our listeners will be in the DC area, but it can be a very strong, even cliche thing in the DC area. Not how are you, but what do you do, right? Like that's just entirely who you are, right? And certainly in many places as well. But I want to highlight that. Obviously we are not our employment. We're not our job. That is not our identity. One thing I want to highlight is for you to think about who you were prior to your federal employment. Particularly if you've been with the federal government for many years, that can start to become, okay, this is who I am. But I want you to think about a time that you say auditioned for something, you tried out for a group, maybe even middle school, high school, right? You auditioned, you tried out for that team. You may have applied to a really good school or a program that was very prestigious, or interviewed for a dream job or position, and you may have gotten it. You might have ended up on that team. You might have ended up going to that school. You might have landed that dream position. But the reality is that the characteristics and the investments of time that you put in to building those skills and that character and those abilities, that's what got you that position. You were not that position prior. You had those characteristics prior. And so who you've been created to be, why you were put on this earth, that existed before your federal job, and that exists now. And so that's something that I'm reminding myself of as well, that those characteristics are still in me. And a fancy job title or whatever doesn't really matter. That doesn't make me who I am. I was created with a first story, a first embodiment of character and characteristics that were planned for many good things. Perhaps federal employment was one of them, but one of many other things. You might be a mom or a dad, sister, brother, husband, wife, whatever. There are characteristics that are just innate to you that can be used to create something new and something beautiful. So you've got that perseverance, that dedication, and you had what it took before you received those accolades, and you've still got them now. So I want you to remember that as you move ahead. I am reminding myself of that as well. You have tons of raw material to work with already. It's just time to build on it and build something new and to navigate a new landscape. You've been here before, and you can do it again. This is new for all of us that this podcast is intended for. And in fact, as of now, I have not recorded a single guest interview for this podcast. Boom, blank slate. So who knows what's ahead? But if you're willing to jump off the deep end with me here, then let's roll. Let's jump. Here's to the Fed Renaissance. Here's to your Renaissance. Let's dive in together. Thanks for joining.